This week on Arizona Illustrated, working to identify migrants who have perished in the desert.
This limbo, this not knowing if they're alive or dead, and if they are dead, has the body been found, but nobody has put two and two together.
Finding a new path after prison.
When I was in prison, I really thought about the people that I had hurt and the damage that I had caused.
What to say and what not to say when grief is in the heart.
The perfect thing to say was, I love you.
And far afield with Tucson poet T.C. Tolbert.
You often mistake reflection for its lyrical sibling, and it hurts to see anything this late.
Welcome to Arizona Illustrated. I'm Tom McNamara. In the midst of the national conversation on illegal immigration, often what gets lost are the stories of people making the dangerous journey, which in many cases leads to their death. Producer Vanessa Barchfield brings us the story of Tucsonans working to find and identify those who don't survive. Here is what remains. Due to the sensitive nature of this content, viewer discretion is advised.
We are at milepost 7 on South Mission Road. Not far from Mission San Javier, not far from Tucson, we're not far from Saurita. And a human being disappeared here in the spot where we're standing.
This is an individual who was found with no other personal effects, no clothing, no backpack, nothing. Found on the Tohono O'odham Nation in August of last year, 2018. The condition of his remains suggests to us that he probably lay out there for 1 to 3 months.
Nancy was from Lima, Peru. She had 2 daughters who lived in New York. She hadn't seen them in years. She was getting extremely depressed. And when she lost her job in 2009, that was the last straw, and she took off north. Nancy had dyed her hair white to look older so that she wouldn't be abused or raped during her journey.
This is the humerus, the upper arm bone, that we can see on him, and one of the reasons we know he's a teenager is that that bone hadn't fully fused. So there was cartilage between this part of the bone and the main part of the bone, so he could have gotten taller.
She took buses all the way through Central America and Mexico, and then she joined up with a coyote, with a guide, and another group of other migrants. They crossed the international boundary pretty quickly on foot, and then they were met by a vehicle that drove them north. Border Patrol pulled up behind them. Everyone who could escape the van ran out into the desert, including Nancy. From there, she was just missing, and the family began what would be a years-long process of trying to find out what happened.
Right now, we don't know who he is. We have no leads to his identity.
As soon as Nancy disappeared, the family actually flew out to this area and searched the desert themselves, interviewed witnesses. I met with them in a hotel off the side of I-10 and took a missing persons report, tried to go to report at police where they were turned away. They went to Border Patrol themselves. They visited consulates.
We're hoping that his mother or his father or another family member eventually reaches out and tells us that he went missing. Not only is loss, personal loss, a tragedy, this limbo, this not knowing if they're alive or dead, and if they are dead, has the body been found but nobody has put two and two together. or are they still laying out there? Part of what we do here is to determine how somebody died, the manner of death, the cause of death, and then help law enforcement with identification.
We now know that actually her remains were found in 2011, about 3.5 miles north of here. It took, however, until 2017 for that cranium that was found to be identified as Nancy's.
We've had a slow motion mass disaster played out over the last 19, 20 years. 3,000 people have come into this office for a post-mortem examination. Some were bodies of people who died that day or the day before. Other people were just represented by a single sun-bleached bone. Of those 3,000, 2,000 have been identified as a specific individual, all from south of the U.S.-Mexico border. We're on the Tohono O'odham Nation, the San Javier District, and we're working with Tohono O'odham Police Department on these 2 mock death scenes, if you will.
That's at 6-4.
One is a typical scatter of remains by animals of somebody who dies on the desert floor. And the other one's somebody who dies in a dry wash, and then their body decomposes, it skeletonizes, and then when the waters come, as we know they always will, some of the bones get washed downstream.
This is kind of exposed, ready to be photographed, and then removed.
We always like to talk to the law enforcement officers who are responsible for recovering these remains, because we do very few recoveries. The Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, very rarely do we send an anthropologist or pathologist or an investigator out to a scene. So we're almost totally reliant on the skills of law enforcement officers.
That's going to indicate I've got 2 individuals. Am I going to be able to see, you know, oh, well, that other left tibia was found 100 yards from here.
We want them to be as thorough as possible, which means not only covering the widest area that makes sense, but while you're in that area, pay close attention to bones that can turn the color of the sand. It's not very pleasant at times. Some of the sights are horrific, some of the smells are horrific. Using your hands, gloved hands on a decomposing body is an assault to several of your senses. These folks lived a hard life, and their skin and their teeth and their bones reflect these stressors that have accumulated. In this young man's case, he didn't live too long, but he still has some of these childhood stress marks written on his bones.
Something that I observed about Bruce Anderson in the early 2000s, he wrote by hand hundreds of missing persons reports. Families were calling him, and he didn't turn them away. It wasn't the right place. You know, a forensic anthropologist usually isn't taking missing persons reports. Usually you refer that to police. Bruce knew that they couldn't go to police. I started typing all of his handwritten missing persons reports into a database. One of them was for a Guatemalan woman. He had stapled a beautiful picture of her wearing traditional Guatemalan traje to his handwritten report. And in addition to her name and the date of disappearance and her age, he'd written on the margin a note that said, she was a nice person. And that stood out to me. It was the representation of someone who was not only collecting data as a scientist, but also listening to a family and being there with them in that moment of crisis.
I know that my best day as a forensic anthropologist is gleaning some really important information that can lead to an identification, That then becomes the worst day a mother or a wife could ever have, because now we know this John Doe has been identified as their son or their husband. So I have to temper, I think most of us do, temper our satisfaction with ourselves of doing a good job by knowing that that's the outcome.
Forensic anthropology can not only identify one individual person, but it can also show patterns across many cases.
The genetic estimate of all living humans is that we're 99.9% alike. In my job, I can do a better service if I can find some of those differences.
There's a quote from Ruth Benedict that the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human difference. It's a very precise science that can come to interact with very deep human need for answers, for truth, and for justice.
Most of the photos you saw in that story are of objects, including shoes, ID cards, and jewelry that were found alongside human remains in Arizona's border region. The photos are from a national database of missing and unidentified people. You can search the database online at nameus.gov. With growing prison populations and changing perspectives on crime and punishment, the call for criminal justice reform is gaining traction. One important question is, what comes after? How can formerly incarcerated people return to their communities in a safe, healthy, and productive way? This story was produced for the American Graduate Getting to Work initiative in cooperation with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
This bridge here is actually an underpass underneath I-19, and this is where I lived for a few years of my life. Being strung out on heroin and cocaine, intravenously I was using about $250 a day. I actually never went to prison for the drug distribution that I was doing. I wound up going to prison again as an adult for grand theft auto. When I was in prison, I really thought about the people that I had hurt and the damage that I had caused. So I made the decision that when I got out, I wouldn't commit any more felonies. It was the best I could do at that time, you know, no more felonies. Misdemeanors are okay, but no more felonies. I was actually even fired from my drug distribution job as the result of my felony. They're like, well, we don't want felons doing transport for us. I got a job as a janitor. It wasn't my life's goal to be a janitor, but that was my starting point.
In 2006, May of 2006, I was released from prison. I went to a treatment center in Tucson, Arizona, and at that point, shortly after you get there, you go on job search. How do you like your new position? I like it. Yeah. From the time that I started looking for employment when I got out of prison to the time that I got a job, I'd probably say about 50 applications. Oh yeah, yeah, and that's not including the cold calls. Hey, are you hiring? You know, and it's just daunting.
The idea is for us to kind of shift our perspective on biblical characters so that
I was about 2 years in recovery. He was about a year in recovery, and we met going to a faith-based recovery meeting. We got married in January of 2010, and it's been like you bring your stuff into your marriage, and so when you live those types of lifestyles, you bring a lot of stuff.
So you've done in there? Yeah. Jennifer and I purchased True Core Cleaning in October of 2016. I actually signed for the purchase of the company on my 10-year sober anniversary. On that day, I put the pen to paper, which is a tremendous testimony. We purchased True Core Cleaning for a couple of reasons. One, we wanted to be able to do our nonprofit work for free. Number two is we wanted to have the opportunity to provide opportunities for other people.
I appreciate my second chance. And I'm not going to take it for granted, because when I was in prison, I thought, like all the stuff I've done, so for me to have a second chance is a blessing.
It's just surreal. This is where I'm at. This is what we do. This is who we are. And it took us a while to get there. I tell people all the time, I'm really honest, like this is difficult, but it's doable.
I have compassion for people. I have love for people, but I don't do well with excuses. I crawled out from under a bridge, and I didn't spontaneously combust into a successful person. It took a lot of hard work, a lot of pain, a lot of tears. It doesn't happen overnight. And so just stay focused. Stay focused on your goals and drive towards them no matter what society tells you.
American Graduate Getting to Work is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Most all of us have known someone who has suffered through the death of a loved one. A common concern at these times is what to say and what not to say to survivors. Jeanette Mauret, the founder of the Ben Spells Project in Tucson, knows from experience what helps and what hurts, and how to choose better words. This is our story from 2015.
"13 years ago, Jeanette came to realize that words can be more powerful than she ever imagined.
Well, Ben is my son, and I have two sons. Matt was born first, and he was born on May 29th. And then 3 years later, Ben was born on May 29th as well. And, we had this sort of happy, simple life and had these beautiful kids. And nearly 3 years after he was born, we lost him very suddenly and unexpectedly. It was a normal day. We were home. I was home with Matt and Ben, and a friend was over. One of the kids' friends was over as well. And Ben had a cold, and I wasn't worried about him. What I didn't know is that he had croup virus and that his airway was closing. And it did. It closed suddenly. And the next thing I knew, I was giving him CPR, and the ambulance was on its way. And they arrived, and they resuscitated him, but he had been out too long, and so he died the next day in the hospital. Well, it was remarkable how people swarmed around us. It was completely life-saving. I learned quickly that when people talked a lot and people sort of feel the need to say something, it often hurt. And it wasn't until later that I could sort of analyze why, and I can certainly speak to that now. But at the time, I just knew that some stuff that people said just hurt. And I knew that their intentions were positive and they were trying to help, but I also knew that the words really, really stung.
Now Jeanette calls on her linguistic training and personal experiences to help others in similar situations use their words for kindness, teaching what to say and what not to say.
And again, I want to emphasize that I realize that this all comes from good intention. And I realize that I probably have also said these things in my lifetime, right? And I recognize that the only way that we can sort of get better at this is if we talk about it. So at least statements, for example, at least you have another son. At least Ben died quickly. At least he didn't suffer. At least you're young enough to have another child. Any sentence that started with the words, you should, also hurt. You should write about this. You should do this. You should do that. The statement, and this was very, very common, be strong. Be strong. That one almost enraged me. And I had to really calm myself around that one. Be strong. Because I guess the subtext for me in that statement is, stop crying, please stop crying because you're making people feel uncomfortable, right? Or what does be strong mean, right? I thought that the fact that I was up and breathing and walking around must be evidence enough that I was strong, because man, I did not want to be up and breathing and, up and about. I wanted to be curled up. Any comment around what I could have or should have done during his death was absolutely impossible to hear. Somebody told me I should learn how to do a tracheotomy. Somebody actually said that to me. People would say religious things. Again, that didn't hurt as badly, but I'm not a religious person. So that was sort of interesting, the things around God needing a little angel, and Ben being with God, and Ben being in heaven, and that sort of thing. And there aren't a lot of great words, right? At least initially. So the things that felt good were, I'm sorry, but said in a tone that was really vulnerable and real, right? So it was more around people's tone and their feel than around actually what they were saying necessarily. I very much appreciated it when people said, I don't know what to say, but I want you to know I'm here. Or I don't know what to say, but I love you. That was powerful. So I very much appreciated people had the courage to come up to me and say something to me, even if sometimes it wouldn't be the perfect thing to say, right? The perfect thing to say was, I love you. I'm here. I'm thinking about you. I'm going to keep checking in with you.
Sometimes the most common phrases don't project the message or meaning the speaker intends.
So how are you? Linguistically, again, it's a greeting. We don't expect sort of the real, oh, well, actually, right? It's oh, yeah, I'm good. How are you? I'm good, right? So there's how are you, the greeting, which is actually, could be dangerous in this situation, in a grieving situation, right? And then there's how are you, really wanting to know how the person's doing. So sometimes just adding the word today at the end of that, how are you doing today, acknowledges that the grief process is sort of up and down and all over the place. Grieving people are supposed to feel sad. Sadness is not, it's the right thing for them to be feeling, right? So the supporter of the grieving person's job is not to cheer up the grieving person. And so allowing them to feel sad, but allowing them to feel safe and supported while they feel sad is the job of the supporter. For us to have people around us who love and care for us, who can just be in it and not have to judge it or change it or fix it, is incredibly powerful.
To cope with their grief, Jeanette and her family began working with clay in their backyard. On the first anniversary of Ben's death, family and friends hung hundreds of handmade ceramic Ben's bells with messages of kindness throughout Tucson.
Ben's Bells comes out of exactly what we're talking about. Ben's Bells was born because my family and I recognized how vital this sort of circle of community and kindness was around us. The kindness didn't take away the sadness. The kindness sort of protected us while we felt the sadness, and that made us feel safe. Supporting somebody who's grieving is a skill. We can't just assume that people are going to understand what kindness looks like in these situations, by osmosis. People actually need to have these conversations.
You can find out more about Ben's Bells education programs and how to volunteer at bensbells.org. And now, from our Far Afield series, we bring you poet T.C. Tolbert, recorded on location at the Snake Bridge on Broadway Boulevard in Tucson.
My name is T.C. Tolbert, and I am Tucson's Poet Laureate. And I'm going to read a poem about my existence as a transgender person and thinking through names. My birth name is Melissa, and so reflecting on that. In someone else's home, 2018, February 8th. You are sitting in front of a considerable yellow mirror. Carved into the frame of the mirror are flowers, the leaves of which, were they solo, could be mistaken for thumbnails lined up at a salon, waiting for the arrival of the hands to which they should be attached. There are fish underwater above you, trying to tell the night what is coming. One fish in particular has eyelashes and a body covered in lines, much like a topographical map. You remember there are tiny brooms all over your own skin that, even if you say stop, will not stop. You have said stop so many times before to your own body, whatever that is, and the lines being drawn upon it. Now that testosterone has occluded estrogen, there must be fewer bodies like yours or more. It's hard to say. You often mistake reflection for its lyrical sibling, and it hurts to see anything this late. The Auburn closet to your right was built after the room was finished. Closet isn't exactly the right word, but neither is metal bar with hangers inside and a regular collection of shelves. You've always been drawn to containers, repositories of any kind, strung with a simple strip of cloth. Perhaps this is why you cannot call Melissa or even Missy your dead name. You understand the problems with birth name, and still you've spent so much time bargaining to believe every name you've ever been called points, at least partially, to a body alive that you are willing to love today. The mirror only returns parts of what holds you to yourself, no matter the angle. And in this way, it is just like language, just like every story about transition with which you've been harassed. Faced with the haunting of our innumerable, we become severing. Your prayer was severed, like the night to which you are repeatedly hope harnessed, and into which, soon enough, you will pass.
Thank you for joining us here on Arizona Illustrated. I'm Tom McNamara. See you next week.